Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a tense comeback. Mrs. Nghia leaves the hospital and returns to her company, where Tu Tieu sets a counter trap, only for a second insider to strike and Lynn to file an official complaint. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The morning Mrs. Nghia left the hospital, the sky looked washed out and cold, like even the sun didn't want to take sides. A nurse handed over the discharge papers with a gentle smile. "Please rest as much as you can," she said. "No stress." Mrs. Nghia nodded, but her eyes said something else. There was still weakness in her face, still a faint tremor in her hands, but the fear was different now. It wasn't panic anymore, it was focus. Tu Tieu stood beside her, holding a small bag of belongings, her posture protective and alert. She didn't look away from the corridor until they stepped into the elevator. Only then did she speak. "We're not chasing rumours," she said quietly. "We're releasing facts." Mrs. Nghia exhaled slowly. "And if the world doesn't care about facts?" Tu Tieu met her eyes. "Then we make facts impossible to ignore." When the elevator doors opened at the ground floor, a flash of light hit them. Someone's phone camera, quick and sneaky, pointed from behind a pillar. Tu Tieu's body shifted instantly, blocking the angle. Mrs. Nghia saw it anyway. Her jaw tightened. "She's still watching?" Tu Tieu didn't answer, but her eyes sharpened. She already knew. Lynn didn't need to win in one day. She only needed to keep Mrs. Nghia exhausted long enough for the board to decide she was too much risk. Outside, the car waited. Tu Tieu guided Mrs. Nghia inside and closed the door firmly. "Straight to the company," Mrs. Nghia said. Tu Tieu hesitated for half a second. "You just got out." "I know," Mrs. Nghia cut in. "That's exactly why we go now. If I hide, she'll call it guilt." The car pulled away. Behind them, the hospital doors slid shut like the end of one battle, and the beginning of the next. The company building looked the same from the outside. Glass, steel, a logo that still meant something. But as soon as Mrs. Nghia stepped into the lobby, she felt the change. Employees looked up, some shocked, some relieved, some nervous. The air was quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was cautious, like everyone had learned that saying the wrong thing could ruin their career. A receptionist stood up quickly. "Mrs. Nghia, welcome back." Mrs. Nghia nodded. "Is the chairman here?" "Yes," the receptionist said, voice low. "He's waiting, in the conference room." As Mrs. Nghia walked forward, Tu Tieu kept close. She caught small details most people missed. A security guard with his hand too close to his radio, an employee whispering while watching them, a phone lifted then lowered. Everyone was measuring this moment. Because Mrs. Nghia returning wasn't just a return, it was a statement. In the elevator, Mrs. Nghia closed her eyes briefly. "They look at me like I'm fragile." Tu Tieu replied softly, "Let them. Fragile people don't walk back into the fire." The chairman stood when they entered the room. He looked exhausted, tie slightly loose, eyes red from sleepless nights. "Mrs. Nghia," he said with careful relief, "I'm glad you're well enough to be here." Mrs. Nghia didn't sit right away. "I'm here because the company needs clarity." The chairman nodded quickly. "Yes, about that. We've been under intense pressure. Investors, media, partners." Tu Tieu spoke calmly. "Pressure created by Lynn's campaign and an internal breach, which you now have proof of." The chairman's face tightened. "We do, and we suspended the board member involved, pending investigation." "Good," Mrs. Nghia said. "Now tell me what you planned while I was in that hospital bed." The chairman hesitated. "We discussed an interim spokesperson. Not to replace you, only to protect. To protect the company by silencing me," Mrs. Nghia said, voice steady. The chairman opened his mouth, then closed it. He couldn't deny it. Mrs. Nghia finally sat. "I am not stepping down. I am not transferring authority. If anyone uses that rumour again, I will consider it a hostile act." The chairman swallowed. "Understood." Tu Tieu leaned forward. "We need to do 3 things today, not tomorrow." The chairman looked wary. "What 3 things?" Tu Tieu held up one finger. "First, internal security reset. Full permission audit, new access controls, remove any legacy backdoors, preserve logs, preserve CCTV. Everything must be court usable. The IT supervisor, already in the room, nodded. "We can begin immediately." Tu Tieu held up a second finger. "Second, a clean public statement. Not emotional, not reactive. A calm announcement that the company is facing coordinated misinformation and that an internal breach has been identified and contained." The chairman frowned. Mentioning a breach could scare investors. Tu Tieu met his eyes. "Silence scares investors more. Silence makes it look like you're hiding," Mrs. Nghia added. "And I will not be treated like a secret." The chairman nodded reluctantly. "All right." Tu Tieu raised a third finger. "Third, a counter trap." The chairman blinked. "A trap?" Tu Tieu's voice stayed even. "Lynn keeps moving because she believes she's still ahead. We need her to reveal her next weapon before she uses it. So we feed a controlled piece of bait inside a very small circle and watch how she reacts." The chairman's jaw tightened. "We just caught one leak. You want to bait again?" Tu Tieu nodded. "Yes, but cleaner, smaller, and monitored." Mrs. Nghia leaned forward. "Explain." Tu Tieu slid her phone across the table, showing the extracted thread again. Timestamps, instructions, templates. "Lynn's pattern is simple," Tu Tieu said. "She reacts fast, she posts fast, she escalates fast. That speed is how we identify her connections." The chairman exhaled. "So what bait do you suggest?" Tu Tieu answered without hesitation. "We create a believable rumour that the board is reviewing a leadership change today, an emergency vote. Only a few people will hear it. If Lynn suddenly shows up with a solution, or pushes an official complaint, we can prove coordination again." Mrs. Nghia's eyes narrowed. "If she shows up, I want her inside the building, on camera, on record." The chairman looked uneasy. "What if she brings press?" Tu Tieu's voice turned cold. "Then we greet them with facts, not fear." By noon, the plan was in motion. The IT team began the security reset. Passwords, permissions, access logs, device checks, CCTV retrieval. Tu Tieu watched it all like a hawk. "Treat every file like evidence," she warned. "No screenshots, no forwarding. Use a secure drive only." The IT supervisor nodded. "Understood." In a smaller office, the chairman drafted the statement with legal counsel, Mrs. Nghia reviewed it line by line, refusing anything that sounded weak. "No, we cannot comment. No, we are evaluating options. No, temporary measures for stability." She wanted calm, not cowardice. Tu Tieu also prepared the bait. She shared it quietly with only 3 people: the chairman, the legal counsel, and the IT supervisor. A simple line, delivered as if it was confidential reality. "The board may be forced to vote on interim leadership today at 4 p.m. Then Tu Tieu waited. Not for hours, for minutes. Because Lynn always moved fast. At 12:47 p.m, Tu Tieu's phone buzzed. A message from the security desk. "Visitor request. Lynn says she's here to help. Wants to see chairman." Tu Tieu's eyes hardened. "She's already here." Mrs. Nghia's face tightened, but her voice stayed steady. "Let her in." The chairman's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Mrs. Nghia stood slowly. "If she wants a stage, she can have one. But we control the lights." Tu Tieu nodded. "Bring her to the main conference room and keep cameras recording." The chairman swallowed and nodded to security. A moment later, the hallway outside the conference room filled with the faint sound of heels. Slow, confident, unhurried. Lynn entered like she owned the building. Her coat was flawless. Her expression was calm, polite, almost warm. "Mrs. Nghia," Lynn said softly. "I'm relieved to see you well enough to return." Mrs. Nghia stared at her. "You came to visit me in the hospital with paperwork." Lynn gave a small, innocent smile. "Paperwork? I came with concern. People misunderstood." Tu Tieu stepped forward. "We didn't misunderstand. We stopped you." Lynn's eyes flicked to Tu Tieu, then back to Mrs. Nghia. "I'm not here to fight," she said. "I'm here to protect the company." The chairman shifted uncomfortably. Lynn continued smoothly. "The board is considering leadership changes. Investors are nervous. If we don't make a calm transition, the company could collapse." Tu Tieu's jaw clenched. She took the bait. Exactly the bait. Mrs. Nghia's voice turned icy. "So you admit you're pushing for my replacement?" Lynn sighed like she was burdened by responsibility, not replacement, just temporary leadership until everything stabilizes. Tu Tieu leaned in, voice low and sharp. Who told you about the 4 p.m. vote? Lynn's smile froze for a fraction of a second. Then she recovered quickly. It's a small company. People talk. Tu Tieu nodded slowly. People talk, and you listen. Through wires we're about to cut. Lynn's eyes narrowed. Threatening me won't help you. Mrs. Nghia stepped forward. You want a temporary seat? You won't get it. Lynn's expression softened again. Then you leave the board no choice. The room went cold. The chairman cleared his throat. Lynn, you're not authorised to. Lynn cut him off, still calm. I'm authorised by public trust, and public trust is falling. Tu Tieu's phone buzzed again. This time it was an IT alert. External upload attempt detected, governance folder targeted. Tu Tieu's eyes snapped to the IT supervisor. Now. The IT supervisor's fingers flew. If Lynn had another insider, they were moving right now, and Mrs. Nghia was finally back in the building to watch the next betrayal unfold. Tu Tieu didn't look at Lynn right away. She looked at the IT supervisor, because the most dangerous enemies were the ones you couldn't see. The IT supervisor's face had gone pale as his eyes tracked the alert on his screen. His fingers moved fast but careful, like one wrong click could erase their only proof. The board chairman swallowed. What does that mean? He asked quietly. Tu Tieu answered without blinking. It means Lynn isn't alone. Lynn's smile stayed in place, but her eyes sharpened. You're accusing me again, she said gently, as if Tu Tieu was being unreasonable. Tu Tieu didn't argue. She spoke to the IT supervisor. Freeze access to the governance folder. Lock any account attempting external upload. Preserve logs. Preserve device ID. The IT supervisor nodded. Doing it now. Mrs. Nghia stood very still at the head of the table, her hands resting on the chair back as if it was the only thing holding her body steady. How many accounts still have access? She asked. Not many, the IT supervisor said, but someone is trying right now to export documents. Lynn leaned forward slightly, voice calm. If your own team doesn't trust you, Mrs. Nghia, why should the public? Mrs. Nghier's eyes flashed. You're not here for the public. You're here for control. Lynn sighed like she was tired of being misunderstood. I'm here to prevent a collapse. Tu Tieu stepped in, placing her phone on the table. Then let's talk about collapse, she said, voice controlled. Because we have your playbook. Lynn's gaze flicked to the phone. More recordings? She asked with a light laugh. That won't save you. Tu Tieu didn't smile. Not a recording. Evidence. She tapped the screen and slid it toward the chairman. On the display were time-stamped messages from the burner number thread, direct instructions to an insider, drafts for smear posts, templates for fake documents. The chairman's face tightened as he scrolled. Lynn's smile didn't vanish, but it became thinner. Anyone can fake screenshots, Lynn said, tone airy. The IT supervisor spoke up, voice steadier now. These are extracted from a device we seized during the internal breach investigation. The chain matches access logs and upload timestamps. Silence. For the first time, Lynn looked slightly annoyed. Just a flicker. A micro crack. Mrs. Nghier's voice turned icy. So you did have someone inside? Lynn tilted her head. And yet here you are, still standing. I'd call that resilience. Tu Tieu's eyes narrowed. Stop performing. You didn't come here to compliment her. You came because you heard about a vote and you thought the door was open. Lynn's gaze sharpened. The board is thinking of stability. That's not my fault. The chairman's jaw clenched. Lynn, he said, voice low. You're not authorised to be part of internal governance discussions. You were invited as a guest, not a decision maker. Lynn's smile returned, cool and confident. Then why did you let me walk in? Tu Tieu answered for him. Because we wanted to see how fast you'd bite. The room went quiet. Lynn's eyes flicked, quick calculations behind them. If you're playing games, she said, you're wasting time. Investors don't care about your traps. Mrs. Nghia stepped forward slowly, her voice calm but firm. Investors care about whether we're being attacked from within, and I am no longer hiding. Lynn's expression softened like she was pleading. Then do the responsible thing. Appoint interim leadership. Rest. Recover. Stop dragging the company through this. Tu Tieu leaned forward, voice sharp. Interim leadership means you get your hands on the wheel, and once you touch it, you'll claim the driver was unfit. Lynn's eyes narrowed. You're paranoid? Tu Tieu didn't blink. You're predictable. At that moment, the IT supervisor's laptop chimed again. He looked up, eyes wide. We traced the upload attempt, he said. It's coming from inside the building, a workstation on the 17th floor. Mrs. Nghia's pulse seemed to freeze. 17th floor, that's finance. The chairman stood up so quickly his chair scraped the floor. Lock that workstation immediately, send security. The IT supervisor nodded and typed fast. Remote lock initiated. Tu Tieu's mind raced. Lynn's presence here wasn't a coincidence, it was timing. If Lynn had another insider, she was using this moment of distraction to pull documents. Lynn watched them scramble with a faint smile. Look at you, she murmured, running in circles. Tu Tieu's eyes cut to her. You're not leaving? Lynn lifted her brows. Are you going to detain me? Tu Tieu's voice stayed calm. No, I'm going to keep you in this room while your network collapses. Lynn's smile thinned. You think you're powerful because you caught a few emails? Tu Tieu leaned closer, lowering her voice so it felt like a blade. I think you're scared because you showed up too fast. Lynn's eyes flashed. Then she turned to the chairman, voice smooth again. Chairman, if this company keeps spiraling, you know what the board will do. They will force a vote. The chairman hesitated, and that hesitation made Mrs. Nghia's stomach drop. Mrs. Nghia looked at him sharply. Don't. The chairman swallowed. We're trying to protect the company. Mrs. Nghia's voice turned cold. Protecting the company does not mean handing it to a saboteur. Tu Tieu reached into her bag and pulled out a printed folder. Clean, organised, labelled with dates. This, she said, placing it on the table, is the evidence package. IT logs, CCTV timestamps, the extracted thread, the hospital paperwork incident report, everything. Lynn's gaze flicked over it, then she laughed softly. You're building a little storybook. Tu Tieu didn't react. No, we're building a legal file. The chairman flipped through the pages. His face tightened as he saw the pattern, how every public spike matched a private leak, how every document appeared minutes after internal mentions, how the hospital incident aligned with the smear timeline. He looked up slowly. This is coordinated. Mrs. Nghia nodded once. Yes. Lynn's smile stayed, but her eyes hardened. So what? You still have a crowd outside. You still have partners doubting you. Proof doesn't erase damage. Tu Tieu met her gaze. No, but it changes who the damage belongs to. The IT supervisor's phone buzzed. He checked it, then looked up. Security reached the 17th floor. They found someone at the workstation. The chairman's voice went tight. Who? The IT supervisor swallowed. A finance manager. They're saying they were following instructions from a burner number. Lynn's eyes flickered. Just once. Tu Tieu caught it. Mrs. Nghia closed her eyes briefly, pain crossing her face. Another one? The chairman slammed his palm lightly on the table. Enough. We're done pretending this is rumour. Lynn leaned back in her chair, calm as ever. You can fire employees all day, you'll still lose the public. Tu Tieu's voice dropped. We're not just firing them, we're exposing the chain. She looked at the chairman. Now we release the statement tonight, with proof that internal sabotage was identified again while Lynn was here pushing for interim control. The chairman hesitated. If we mention her, we don't need to name her, Tu Tieu said. We let timing speak, we let evidence speak, and we restrict her access to this building. Lynn's smile tightened. You can't ban me. Mrs. Nghia spoke calmly, every word heavy. I can. The room went still. Mrs. Nghia turned to the chairman. Issue a formal notice. Lynn is not permitted to enter company property. Security will enforce it. Legal will deliver it. The chairman nodded slowly, as if deciding whether he was brave enough. Yes, ma'am. Lynn stared at him, the first true anger showing on her face. You're choosing her? The chairman's voice was low. I'm choosing the company. Lynn exhaled, then smiled again, cold, controlled. Fine. You win today. Tu Tieu didn't relax. You don't show up like this unless you plan something bigger. Lynn's eyes glittered. Maybe I did. She stood, smoothing her coat. Security in the hallway shifted, ready. Lynn paused at the door and looked back at Mrs. Nghia. You think returning to this building makes you strong, she said softly. But strength isn't standing up. Her gaze slid to Tu Tieu. Strength is making people believe you're standing in the wrong place. Then she walked out. The door closed. For a moment the room was silent, heavy with relief and dread at the same time. Mrs. Nghia sat down slowly, her knees shaky. We caught another insider, she whispered. So why does it feel like we're still losing? Tu Tieu picked up her phone again. Because Lynn's next move won't be inside the building, she said quietly. It'll be outside, public, official. As if to confirm it, the chairman's phone buzzed. He looked down, and the colour drained from his face. What? Mrs. Nghia asked. The chairman swallowed. A legal notice just came in, he said. A formal complaint, filed this afternoon. Tu Tieu's spine went cold. From Lynn? The chairman nodded slowly. She's accusing Mrs. Nghia of wrongdoing and requesting emergency review of leadership. Mrs. Ngia's breath caught. Tu Tieu's eyes hardened into steel. That's why she came in person, she whispered. Not to win here, but to distract us while she made it official. Mrs. Nghia looked at Tu Tieu, fear mixing with fury. Then what do we do? Tu Tieu leaned forward, voice low and fierce. We answer officially, tomorrow morning, not with emotion, with a counter-complaint, with evidence, and with one move that forces Lynn to testify under oath. The chairman stared. Can we do that? Tu Tieu nodded once. Yes. Then Tu Tieu's phone finally lit up with a weak incoming call. A name flashed. Uri. Tu Tieu answered instantly. Uri? His voice came through broken, urgent. I saw the news. Is my mother okay? Tell me the truth. And then the line crackled. The call cut. Tu Tieu stared at the screen, jaw tight. Because now Uri was waking up, and Lynn's war had officially reached the point where someone had to come home.